In a moment, we'll be in Matthew 16, if you want to take your Bibles there, Matthew 16. And while you're doing that, I want to tell you what a joy it's been to be with you this week. It's been encouraging to me. I always have thought that a man who gets to come and do a gospel meeting gets far more out of the meeting than you all do, because you just got to know me, but I got to meet all of you. And I'll go back much richer than just getting to meet one person or know one person. And I really have enjoyed the hospitality of the Alvarezes, getting to know Jackson and Cassie better, and Al, and just all of those that I've gotten to spend time with. It's been truly a blessing to know all of you. My sermon tonight, oh, and by the way, Jackson, I think you were probably in grade school when this meeting was being talked about, actually. It was like 2016, so you might have been in high school. Yeah, you were in high school, okay. So, my sermon title tonight, Who is Jesus to you, and what are you doing about it, was not a sermon title that I chose. In fact, when I first was asked to preach this lesson from a church across town in Minnesota there, I didn't really like the title. I thought the questions were a little bit too in your face or a little bit too cheesy or something. This church kind of always does that to me in their summer programs. They give me a title and I don't like the title. But every time I work on the sermon that they've asked me to work on, it challenges me and it benefits me. And the more I've thought about those two questions, the more I think they're good questions. But I want to start the sermon the same way I did for them all those years ago. And I will say this, I don't care who Jesus is to you. And you ought not care who Jesus is to me. The question really should be, who is Jesus actually? We don't get to make him up. We don't get to have our own personal Jesus like Depeche Mode or Johnny Cash sang, depending on who you like, which version of that song you like. The question should be from everybody is, who is Jesus actually? Not only who did he say that he was, but was he who he says he was? There's a question like that here in Matthew 16. So let's read this. I know this is familiar, but please look at this with fresh eyes, starting in verse 13. When Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Now this passage, this conversation between Jesus and his disciples is what I might call a template text. And what I mean by that is, you notice that Jesus asks a question, a religious question, a question about God, a question about truth. And just like in our day and age, when you ask a question like that, there's always lots of answers. Some say this, others say this. And the reason I think this is a template text is it reminds us that there is a right answer to questions like that. And whenever somebody asks a question about God or the Bible or truth, and people start saying, well, some say this and some say that, what we should be looking for is the answer not revealed by flesh and blood, but by our Father who's in heaven. That's the best answer. And according to Jesus, when he speaks to Peter, the blessed answer. Blessed are you. You got this right. You know, this question was asked in a location, Caesarea Philippi, that I think brings a color to it that I missed for a long time. I didn't think much about this until I visited Israel a few years ago, and I went to the ruins or the site where Caesarea Philippi used to be. And if you've ever been there, if you look up pictures of this online, the city was built up against a cliff, kind of a mountain or a cliff. And out of the base of that cliff comes water, really cold water coming up from deep down in the earth. And the ancient people built temples there and shrines. There was a temple at the time of Jesus. There was a temple to the god Zeus, a temple to the god Pan, and I think 4 or 5 other gods that were worshipped in this multicultural worship center. And that's the place Jesus chose to ask the question, who do people say that I am? Around all these gods. And folks, as our times get more and more pluralistic and more people just sort of say whatever you want to believe is just as valid as anything else, a question like who is Jesus is a really important question to ask. Peter got it right, and we need to get it right as well. But let me say a couple of other things about how some people might answer this question, who is Jesus to you? Now, if I go back to my earliest years, growing up in San Diego, California, it was rare for me to find kids that I went to school with that were believers, or at least would say that they were. There was this one kid that I always kind of looked up to. And if you were to ask him back in those days, who is Jesus to you? Here's what he would have said. I'm not trying to be flippant or funny. He just would have said this. He would have said, Jesus is my homeboy. You ever heard that before? We talked like that in Southern California in the 80s. But if you said, well, what are you doing about the fact that Jesus is your homeboy? He would say, I wear this t-shirt that says that. He would. To public school in San Diego, California in the 80s. And he would get made fun of and teased. And I really liked that he was bold enough to say things like that out loud. But here's the thing with my friend. He didn't really know what Jesus taught. He didn't live what Jesus taught. He just liked to say that out loud. Is that enough? To go around and just say, Jesus is my friend, Jesus is my homeboy, be bold to say things like that, but not really live for him? Of course not. I've met people throughout the years that they wouldn't use these words, but this is kind of how they treated Jesus. They would say, Jesus is my good luck charm. I keep him in my life just in case, you know. I hang him around my neck on a gold chain, or I put a crown of thorns as a tattoo around my bicep just to make sure he's sort of part of me. I actually heard a lady say this one time. I was in Los Angeles preaching there, and a Persian woman who had moved from Persia to LA said to one of our members that she wanted to learn about this Jesus that she'd heard so much about. So a couple of us went to her house, and when we walked into the dining room, there was a crucifix of Jesus, or a depiction of him, of course, hanging above her dining room table. And I looked at it, and I looked at her, and I said, I thought you didn't know anything about him. And she said, oh no, I don't. That's just there in case. I think it keeps evil spirits away. That was how she was treating Jesus. Is that enough? Let me get a little closer to home. If you would have asked me when I was younger, who is Jesus to you and what are you doing about it? I might have said something like this. Jesus is the founder of his church, and I make sure that I go to the right one. Now, I think that's important, that we recognize who it is and what it was that Jesus established, and that we try to associate with people that believe in that. But I'm going to suggest even an attitude like that isn't enough. Let me explain what I mean. Go with me to Luke chapter 4. Luke 4. I want to show you a group of people who knew Jesus in a way that you and I never will in this life until someday we see him. And even then, it's a question on whether or not we'll ever get to experience what these people experienced. But let me begin this by asking a couple of questions. I would assume that nearly all of you in here tonight, you love Jesus Christ with all your heart, right? You love him. Can any of you tell me what color his eyes were? How tall was he? What did it sound like when he laughed? Do any of you that love him know the answers to those questions? The people we're about to read about could answer every one of them. These women in the synagogue where he grew up could look out in a field and watch him running and playing as a child, recognize him by his gait. They could hear him laugh in another room or outside, and they would know that it was him. I wish I knew those things about him. But let's read a little bit more about these people, starting in verse 14, Luke 4:14. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through all the surrounding district. And he began teaching in their synagogues and was praised by all. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. And he opened the book, found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." And he closed the book, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And all were speaking well of him and wondering at the gracious words which were falling from his lips. And they were saying, "Is this not Joseph's son?" All right, a couple of things about this. At the beginning of our reading, verse 14, Jesus had been going all around Galilee preaching, causing a stir. People were hearing more and more about him. And he comes back to his hometown of Nazareth. And I really like verse 16 that says it was his custom to be in the synagogue on the Sabbath. If you call yourself a follower of Jesus, I want you to understand that it was his custom to be with God's people when God's people met. And it should be your custom too. But on this particular day, he's handed the book or the scroll of Isaiah. And he goes through the scroll. They didn't have chapter and verse divisions back then, but he would have found the place that is our Isaiah 61. We're going to go there in a little while. And he reads this text, says some words about it, goes and sits down. And what does it sound like to you as their reaction to his sermon at first? According to my Bible, it says they were wondering at the gracious words. They were speaking well of him. They were whispering to each other. Did you hear that? That was fantastic. But who was Jesus to them? Did you catch it at the end of verse 22? Is this not Joseph's? I've tried to figure out maybe how to feel this text. So I'm going to use an illustration for this church. You guys all know Nathan back there? Little Nathan. It's right? That's Nathan. That's your name. You guys know Nathan, right? I want you to imagine this. A couple decades from now, Nathan decides to be a preacher. And he's going all over Illinois and up into Wisconsin and wherever preachers go to preach around here. And you keep hearing that wherever he goes and preaches, he's just like knocking their socks off. He's doing a great job. And one day he comes and stands in this pulpit in front of all the people that watched him grow up. And he preaches a sermon that makes you whisper when he gets done. Did you hear that? That was amazing. Did you hear the words that he said? All right, here's my question. You love this boy. You've seen him grow up. But that's Heather's son, right? Is there anything that boy could say to you in the next few minutes after he preached a lesson like that could make this group of God's people want to do to him what this hometown crowd wants to do to Jesus a few verses later? Skip down to verse 28. And all the people in the synagogue were filled with rage as they heard these things. They got up, drove him out of the city, led him to the brow of the hill on which their city had been built in order to throw him down the cliff. But passing through their midst, he went his way. Let me ask it again. Is there anything a kid who grew up around you could say after he just preached an amazing lesson and made you wonder at his gracious words? Could he say like a few more sentences and make you so angry that you drag him out of the building and try to kill him? That's hard for me to recognize in my head. These are God's people. How could they do this? I wonder if it has something to do with the words Jesus says between verse 23 and verse 27. I think it might. And we're going to come back to this at the end of the lesson. But I also think it might have something to do with the passage that he was quoting and then saying these words. So let's go back to Isaiah 61. And we're going to spend some time there before we come back to Luke 4 to finish our lesson here in a little while. Isaiah chapter 61. I'm going to give you a brief outline of this chapter, and maybe it'll help you remember how this chapter works. In Isaiah 61, the first 3 verses describe what Jesus came to do for us, the work that he came to accomplish in our lives. That's verses 1 through 3. Verse 4 through the end of the chapter, 4 through 11, is what he came to do with us, or maybe through us. You see the difference? Verses 1 through 3, what he came to do for us. Verses 4 through 11, what he came to do with us or through us. But it also kind of should answer these 2 questions for tonight. Verses 1 through 3 should answer the question for you, who is Jesus to me personally? What has he done in my life? Verses 4 through 11 should answer the question, what am I doing about it? Like, in what way is he using my life now? That's how we're going to break this text down. All right, I'm going to read verses 1 through 3, and what I want you to do as we read it is just see if you're in these verses anywhere. If you can answer the question, who is Jesus to you? You should be able to find yourself in verses 1 through 3. Let's read. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord, the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a spirit of fainting. So they will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. You know, as much as that text is about Jesus himself, he's the one that the Spirit of the Lord was upon. He was the one that was anointed to bring these things. Did you notice that almost every verse is about the people that he would help? It's about us. Did you see yourself anywhere? Go back through this. Back in verse 1, the first thing it says he came to do was to bring good news to the afflicted. Your version might say, to preach the gospel to the poor. Is that who Jesus is to you? I have a feeling that might be true for some of you. You were born into a life of affliction. Your family was dysfunctional. Life was hard. Everything was kind of messed up from as far back as you can remember. Every time you thought like things were going to get better and you thought you'd turned a corner, things would just fall apart again. You know, there was abuse and there was difficulty. I mean, there was never any good news in your life. And then one day, you heard of Jesus and his teaching and his preaching, and everything changed. Because he was the good news bringer to all of your affliction. Is that who Jesus is to you? Let me tell you who he is to me. It's the second thing on the list. It says in verse 1 that he was sent to bind up the brokenhearted. How many of you have ever had a broken heart? Most of you had a broken heart? I think when we ask that question, we usually think of romance, you know. Like maybe you fell in love and they didn't love you back, or they loved you for a while and then it didn't work out. I'm not just talking about that kind of heartbreak. I think heartbreak can happen even in other relationships or even when we break our own hearts. But I remember my first broken heart, or at least I remember what happened when I remembered my first broken heart. I was 8 years old. I had a best friend named Chris Thompson. He lived in my neighborhood. He was this gangly kid, kind of clumsy, but we were best of buddies. He never had 2 front teeth as long as I knew him. He had fallen down and knocked him out and he never grew back. But that was Chris. He was my best friend. One day, Chris told me that his dad was being transferred from San Diego, California to somewhere in Texas. Our parents weren't friends. This was before the internet. I'm that old. Before cell phones. And we just knew we were never going to see each other again. So I remember the last day we walked home from school together. I turned right at Capehart Street. He would go further on to his house. And we stood there for a while, awkwardly trying to say goodbye forever. Have a nice life. You too, buddy. And when I started towards home, I got tears in my eyes and I started to run as fast as I could, and I came through the front door and my mom was standing there. And she said these words to me. She said, "Ah, honey, you have a broken heart." And I remember thinking something like, I don't want to feel that anymore. I was beginning to learn that the way broken hearts work is you attach your heart to somebody or something, and this world's pretty cruel, isn't it? When something that you care about is ripped away from you, it leaves your heart sort of all shattered. But you know what my best idea was? Just don't attach it to anything else. Build walls around it, harden it up, But my mom wouldn't let me do that. She taught me there was a God who could put your heart back together, that you could keep loving people, and even if it hurt later when it would break, you could just keep loving people. You know why that was such an important lesson for me? 2 years later, when I was 10, that mother who was my comfort died of cancer. She was only 42 years old. And if I thought that I'd had a broken heart before, I was just getting started in my life. Do you know who Jesus is to me? He's the tailor of my heart, countless times. He's put that heart back together more times than I know how to tell you about. And if you ask me, what am I doing about it? Every day I meet people who have broken hearts. And I know someone that can help them. Is that who Jesus is to you? By the way, if you haven't noticed this yet, no one's getting out of this lesson alive tonight. You got to figure this out. Who is he to you? And maybe you even see where this is going, don't you? What was the problem with the Nazareth people? Well, they knew everything about him, but they were never going to let him be their physician. They were never going to let him inside to fix what needed fixing in their lives. They wanted to control him, not for him to control them. There's a lot more things in this great list. Is your story the rest of verse 1 to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners? That didn't mean Jesus was going to come kick the Romans out, and end the Roman occupation in Judea. It didn't mean he was going to open all the jail cells. Some of you know exactly what this is. You were a prisoner and enslaved to some behavior, some attitude. You were angry all the time and you couldn't stop being angry until you learned from Jesus how to fix that. And now you're a gentle person. Or you were addicted to something that you kept putting in your body or watching on a screen, and he set you free from that. Is that who Jesus is to you? Until each one of us figures out how to answer that, I think we're always going to struggle to know how we can help others come to him. In fact, I really like the end of verse 3 after this section. It's my favorite metaphor for Christians in all the Bible. You see at the end of verse 3 when it says, "So they will be called," my version says oaks of righteousness. Your version might say trees or terebinths. I like the oaks reference, I think, the best. Why was Jesus going to come and fix all of us up? Well, so that we could be oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that God would be glorified. Why oak trees? What do you guys think of oak trees? Really, when you see them out there in the wild, what do you think of them? They're solid, right? We build out of them. But have you ever noticed that an oak tree is kind of ugly and twisted and creepy? Especially when the sun starts going down and there's vultures in it. It's a weird tree because it's beautiful in its own way. But it's all scarred, like the wind and the storms and the years have just beaten the thing up. Why would God choose a metaphor like that for us? Come on, you guys know each other. Is there any one of us in here that's not scarred by life and twisted up from all the years? And yet here we are because of what Jesus has done with us. He's planted us for God's glory to show to the world. Who is Jesus to you? Let's skip to the next part, verses 4 through 11, and let's try to answer the question, what are we doing about it? And what are you doing about it? Verse 4. Then they will rebuild the ancient ruins. They will raise up the former devastations. They will repair the ruined cities, the desolation of many generations. Strangers will stand and pasture your flocks. Foreigners will be your farmers and your vine dressers. But you will be called the priests of the Lord. You will be spoken of as ministers of our God. You will eat the wealth of nations, and in their riches you will boast. Instead of your shame, you will have a double portion. Instead of humiliation, they will shout for joy over their portion. Therefore, they will possess a double portion in their land. Everlasting joy will be theirs. All right, let's kind of talk through some of this. Go back to verse 4. If I asked you to choose a profession, a job that verse 4 describes, what profession would you choose? Rebuilding ancient ruins, raising up former devastations, repairing ruined cities. What job does that sound like? Construction? Builders? Maybe even more specific. You ever seen those FEMA workers that come in after some sort of devastation, an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane, and the place is leveled, and all these people come in behind it, and they put the world back together. Look at what the prophecy says. That verses 1 through 3, Jesus was going to come and put our lives back together. And then he was going to take us and turn us loose in a world that needs to be put back together. That we would be the builders. We would be the ones who would repair the ruined cities, the desolation, not just of one generation. This isn't just talking about Babylonian captivity and coming back from that. This is a world that's been wrecked by sin. And Jesus, remember, he said in Luke 4, today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. He was about to unleash an army full of people to go put the world back together. You know, until I get a sense that that's what I'm doing in my life, then maybe I don't know who Jesus is to me. Skip down to verse 6. Look at verse 6. You'll be called the priests of the Lord. You'll be spoken of as ministers of our God. What a great prophecy this is. That these people that would be helped by the Lord would be the priests and the ministers. Do you think in the Old Testament it was a privilege to be a priest? What do you think? Was it a privilege to be a priest in the Old Testament? To get to serve God on men's behalf, serve men on God's behalf? But could anybody be a priest in the Old Testament? If you just wanted to be, could you be? You couldn't. You had to be born of the tribe of Levi, son of Aaron. If you weren't born in the right family, you couldn't be a priest. But you see what the prophecy is saying is that God's going to have a whole kingdom full of priests. Where are they going to come from? What's their pedigree? What's their heritage? Verses 1 through 3. The ash heap of humanity. God's going to raise up the priests from the darkness, from their sin, and give them this privileged place to serve the world. You know, when I think about the first century people that were hearing Jesus say that this was happening in their time, I think they were as excited, if not more excited, about verses 4 through 11 than they were verses 1 through 3. God's going to change the world with us. I want to be a priest. But unless someone lets Jesus help them, he's never going to use them to help the world. That's maybe why he says what he says in verse 8. Look at verse 8. I, the Lord, love justice. I hate robbery and the burnt offering. I will faithfully give them their recompense and make an everlasting covenant with them. What does that verse mean? God hates robbery in the burnt offering. You know, in the new covenant, which this is predicting, we're not actually making burnt offerings. But the New Testament does teach that we offer something. What do we offer? Romans 12, 1 and 2. I urge you by the mercies of God to present your bodies as living sacrifices. It's sort of like this. Look, if I've been redeemed by God, you know what God hates is robbery. What he deserves in sacrifice is all of me. And that's what Romans 1 and 2 says. We've got to be all in on this. And if you're all in on this, now look at verse 9. Then their offspring will be known among the nations, their descendants in the midst of the peoples. All who see them will recognize them because they're the offspring whom the Lord has blessed. Have you ever had this happen to you? Somebody in your family or your workplace or your neighborhood comes to you and says something like this. You know, I've known a lot of people over the years that call themselves Christians, but there's something different about you. Like you really mean it. And you go to church like all the time and you're actually living the way that you're supposed to be living. Because here's what God promises. People who are all in, who know who Jesus is to them, and they're doing the things that they ought to be doing, and they're giving God their lives, they are recognizable people. And that's the promise of the prophecy. Let's look at the rest of this text, verses 10 and 11. I will rejoice greatly in the Lord. My soul will exult in my God, for he's clothed me with garments of salvation. He's wrapped me with a robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself with a garland, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. Isn't that New Testament language there? Brides and bridegrooms and garments of salvation and robes of righteousness. God has given us forgiveness in Christ Jesus. He's made this everlasting covenant with us. Look back at verse 8. This is New Testament language for us. But now I want you to notice the poetry in the imagery of verse 11. Here is how God describes what he was going to do with the church. For as the earth brings forth its sprouts, and as a garden causes the things sown in it to spring up, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all the nations. Folks, what a beautiful prophecy that was. In a world full of darkness, remember back in chapter 60, verse 2, deep darkness will cover the earth. God says in chapter 61, when the Messiah comes and he gets a hold of your life and he binds up your broken heart and releases you from your captivity, takes away your spirit of fainting, gives you a spirit of joy, he's going to cause a garden to grow all over planet Earth in every nation. And if you doubt that, just think about it. We are 2,000 years removed from the preaching of Jesus in Nazareth that day. On a different continent, across the ocean. And you know what God's done in this place? He's caused righteousness and praise to spring up in the United States of America. And we're a part of that story. But I want to challenge you with something in verse 11 that maybe took me a little while to notice, but when I finally noticed it, it troubled me. Do you see the two things that God says he would cause to spring up? Righteousness and praise. You guys see those two things? Every once in a while, I'll visit a church, and it becomes very apparent to me that that church is righteous. They've got right doctrine. They live good lives. The people are holy people. They're living righteous lives. But sometimes those groups of Christians, they don't do a lot of praising God outside of their four walls. They're righteous, but praise isn't really happening. And then I'll visit other churches where I kind of get excited because I stalk them on social media before I go there. You're not the only ones that do that to the preachers, by the way. And on their social media, all the Christians are like, God is great, God is good, praise God. They're like very vocal about God all the time. But then when I get there, I realize some of those Christians who are praising God all the time, they're not living righteously. They don't care about the right doctrine. They don't teach the right things. They're not living as they should. They are all praise, but very little righteousness. Did you know neither one of those things on their own gets God's job done? In fact, if I was to ask you this, what does the Bible call somebody who praises God with their lips, but by their deeds they deny him? They live a different life than the ones they speak. What does the Bible call that? Hypocrisy. Is that dangerous? Yeah, God says because of hypocrisy, the name of God is blasphemed among the nations. But if praise without righteousness is hypocrisy, have you ever thought about what righteousness without praise is? I learned this lesson when I was 19 years old. Before I decided to preach, I worked for a capital money management firm in downtown San Diego. It's not as prestigious as it sounds. I ran the shipping and receiving department for that group. They were trying to get me to become one of those guys, and they were willing to put me through school. But one day I asked one of the higher ups, like, hey, if I'm going to do this job, what do I have to be good at? And this is what he said to me. He said, you got to really, really love money. And I knew the Bible, and there's some sort of verse about that. But I decided while I was there that I was going to leave and I was going to go preach, go learn to preach. Word got around the office. Now, let me tell you backstory to this. When I moved into that company, I was determined to be a light. I wanted to go the extra mile. I wanted to show people that I cared for them. I always came with like a good attitude and a smile, and I was trying to be an influence in that place. When word got around the office that I was leaving, it didn't surprise some people. Some of them made fun of me. Some of them asked me weird questions like, hey, I hear you're going to be a priest. And I'd be like, nope, I'm already one of those. And they'd be like, what? And then I'd show them Isaiah 61 and stuff like that. Some of them say, are we going to see you on TV asking for money? And I'd be like, if you ever see me asking for money on TV, don't send me any money. All right, but here's the story. The last day I was there, I was on the elevator with this guy named Craig. Craig was young, early 30s, super successful, very rich. And he nudged me and he said, hey, Andy, I hear you're leaving to be a preacher. And I kind of straightened up and I was like, that's right. He said these words to me. He said, man, I always knew you were a really good guy, but I never knew you were a Christian. You see, what I had been was all righteousness without praise. If praise without righteousness is hypocrisy, do you know what righteousness without praise is? It's self-promotion. Craig only thought Andy Cantrell was a pretty good guy. But if I'd have been willing to tell my story, the only reason I ever knew anything good was because of God. And if he would have been understanding because I would have taught more and praised God more. You know, folks, confession is not just something we do at salvation. Confession is a way of life. Jesus said, if you confess me before man, I'll confess you before my Father. He wants us to live lives where we're speaking his name, unashamedly talking about who he is and what he's done in our lives. I don't know if that story helped you, but I have a feeling that for many of us who care very much about holy living and right doctrine, that's sometimes our shortcoming. We're not living lives of hypocrisy. We're just living lives where we're making it seem as if we're the greatest people around. Go with me back to Luke 4, and let's finish the lesson. What did Jesus say to those folks that day that made them so angry that they were willing to go try and kill him? Let's read it, beginning in verse 23. Jesus said to them, "No doubt you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Whatever we heard was done at Capernaum, do here in your hometown as well.'" Here's what he's sort of saying to them. You guys aren't going to let me help you. You think I'm Joseph's son, but you're not going to let me into your heart or into your life. You're not going to change anything. In fact, you're going to get jealous because I'm going to go out in all these other places like Capernaum and do things, and you're going to be like, why aren't you doing that here? And he's sort of indicating that they weren't going to accept him. Now, what he says next is he tells them two Bible stories, or two scenes from the Bible, I guess, that I think they'd always missed. Here they are. Verse 24. "Truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his hometown. But I say to you in truth, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, when a great famine came over all the land. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, but none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. And now they want to kill him." What did he say? I think sometimes people who've been Bible students, they don't like it so much when like a young guy, like a Jesus who's uneducated in their mind, comes from the hill country of Nazareth and tells people older than him things that they've never noticed. But think about this. Do you think there were widows in Israel in the days of Elijah? What do you think? Do you think there were widows in Israel in the days of Elijah? Show me a Bible story where Elijah helped any widows in Israel. You won't find one. What you will find is that he helped a widow in a different place from a foreign country where he was welcome to do his work. What about Elisha? Do you think there were lepers in Israel in the days of Elisha? Do you think so? Show me a Bible story where he ever helped any lepers in Israel. You won't find one. The one that he helped was Naaman the Syrian. By the way, I love putting this with the story of Naaman. Does anybody remember who told Naaman that there was a prophet in Israel that could heal his leprosy? Do you remember who told him? A servant girl who'd been stolen from Israel. Do you know what Jesus just told us? That little girl had never even seen Elisha do it. She just knew that he could. What does this have to do with us? About 18 years ago, I was invited to move to Minnesota. And the elders that were there at the time said, "Hey, Andy, you're culturally different." That was very true. "We want you to come here and get us stirred up some." And this is what they told me. They said, "There are people here, they want to teach their friends, they want to teach their neighbors. We know you've been evangelistic. We want to get started." So it was exciting. I showed up. And that church got to work. But you know what I noticed about who really got to work? It was younger Christians. And I don't mean younger in age. I mean like newer Christians. People who'd come to the Lord just lately. We had some people that were converted out of really, really dark and difficult things. And what was crazy is they were the ones getting all the Bible studies. They were bringing people around. They were inviting people. They were having studies with people. And there were a few people sitting on the pews with their arms folded, and they started saying things like this. "How come I'm not getting to do any Bible studies? What's going on around here?" By the way, there was a weird dynamic in our church. When we would have a Bible class, the folded arms people answered all the questions in Bible class. They knew the answers. They could quote the verses. They could tell you about Jesus. They knew all the stuff about him. In fact, the new Christians were embarrassed because they didn't know where stuff was in the Bible. But for whatever reason, it was the newer Christians that were bringing all their friends. Do you know what was going on with some of those people? Some of those people that had their arms folded, they had never let Jesus take care of some things that needed taken care of. They were just as angry as they'd ever been. They were just as captive to their broken heart as they had always been. I mean, they'd sat there for decades knowing Joseph's son and all the answers. But they didn't know who Jesus was to them. Because until you know what Jesus has done for you and you think of it daily and you remember it, there's just often not going to be the zeal that needs to be there. I get guilty of this. The longer I walk with God, the more I forget what once was. When I am grateful for all the changes that He's made, but I just sometimes forget. You know, someday somebody may come through those doors back there who makes you really uncomfortable. They don't look like you. Their life's a disaster. But if Jesus gets a hold of them and changes their life and changes their heart, don't be surprised if they don't start changing the world around you. But I would hope you wouldn't wait for that you'd start now, that you'd figure out and remember who it is that the Lord is to you. Or if you've never let Him into your life, even after all these years, that you would finally have the humility to say, Jesus, be my physician, because I want to do work for you. Let me tell you one more story about this. I preached this lesson one time at a fairly large congregation in a different place. I won't tell you where, just so nobody can connect the dots. And I poured my heart into it. I offered the invitation. I hoped that maybe it would stir somebody to get things right. And maybe it did. You know, they don't have to come forward for that to happen. But the next day, an elder in that congregation who had a large family in that congregation took us all out to eat. I think it was for breakfast. And I'd heard some stories about this elder and some of the family of this elder, that he was a pretty hard man, a pretty harsh man, that he had a lot of control issues. And when we sat down for breakfast that day, he said, I want to have everyone's attention. Family, I want you to listen. He said that last night, that sermon that was preached, he said, I didn't sleep last night. He said, because I think that sermon was about me. He said, all these years, I've just still been so angry and mean. And I don't know that I know who Jesus is to me. And he said, from today on, it's going to be different. I appreciated that. So did his family. Look, I don't care when it happens. Tonight, tomorrow, within the next few days. But I hope the words that Jesus preached that day and the great prophecies of Isaiah will get into your heart and into your head. Remind you of what it is that the Lord's done for you. Help you remember that there's a world out there that's fallen apart, that people need help, that we are the ones that are supposed to be bringing people back, showing praise and righteousness among the nations, being the garden of God in this place. And I hope that you'll just do that with all your heart and with all your zeal. Thanks for your attention tonight. We're going to sing a song that's meant to stir us up, and if we can help you with anything at all, let us know while we stand and sing together.